Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for coming. And Nick and I have come from different places lately, and we've been on the road a lot. So being with you here today is kind of like being on a hot date. So, well, I'm here because we wrote together A Path Appears. And no, it's not a book about hiking. Actually, it was. I saw it in a bookstore next to a book on the best paths for hiking. This is a book about solutions for change. And we have talked to many, many change makers. I wish we talked to some of them that you've seen today, because they were fabulous. But one of the main challenges, one of the biggest challenges that this world faces today is basically growing inequity, the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Even President Obama said that it is the defining challenge of our time. So the question is, what are you going to do? Are you going to get engaged? Or are you going to become a bystander? There are a lot of ways to change this. There are a lot of solutions. We've done a lot of research. But one of them that I will speak to you today about has to do with enterprise, bringing capitalism into compassion. One of the examples I will give you has to do with food. It's called the Greyston Bakery. If you live in Yonkers, New York, you may have actually stopped by and tasted one of their brownies. It was formed several decades ago by Bernie Glassman, who was an aerospace engineer. And he was based in Long Beach, California. He loved engineering, but then he got into Zen Buddhism, and he realized that his life up until then was kind of misplaced. And he said, I'm giving up aerospace engineering, and I want to help change society. So I came back to Yonkers, New York, and he started a bakery. His wife was a good baker, so that was something that he knew. And he then said, the premise of my bakery is going to be that I will hire anybody, everybody who walks in the door. Literally, open door policy. And he was going to give these people training, and he was going to let them rise or fail on their own. And if they didn't pass the training after a year or two, then he would say goodbye. So that meant that he hired ex-convicts, ex-drug addicts, homeless people, hired everyone. I met someone named Dion Drew, who basically had been in jail for selling drugs. That was the only thing he knew how to do. And he said, on a lark, I applied to Greyston Bakery, and he got in. He got in a job. Well, so now, basically, Greyston Bakery has survived over the years, and they also innovate. It's not as if this is just, something, a placeholder for all of these people. They actually have innovated. They actually made the brownie wafers for ice cream sandwiches in Ben & Jerry's ice cream sandwiches, and when sandwiches went the way, when they started disappearing, they innovated and created the new popular flavor. Now it's not so new anymore, but the chocolate fudge ice cream, which is one of the most popular flavors. And they're selling in Whole Foods, so they've become very successful. And this is the kind of enterprise that really helps change the local communities. Another one has to do with something that goes on halfway around the world, in Kenya. In Kenya, there was a woman named Shannon May, who with her husband, Jay Kimmelman, have set up what they call basically the McDonald's approach to mass education. They are creating standardized schools to reach the low-income people in Kenya. So if you think we have low-income people here, they have even more poor people in Kenya. And they're educating them. Basically, everything is standardized. They create franchises, basically wholly owned franchises, but basically they can swoop in on an area that they've decided is what they will build, where they will build a school. And then from that day on, for the next 6 months, they will actually build the school, they will hire the teachers, they will train the teachers and the administrators, they will have the books, and they will set up the lesson plans. Now, to make sure that this is all standardized, they can hire teachers who don't have PhDs, who don't have master's degrees. They basically hire people who speak English, and they use the iPad with the lesson plans, and they basically can deliver the lessons. And these kids are reading at reading levels and math levels are above those of the local public schools. So they've become very successful. Another one, let's bring it back home, is Springboard Collaborative. That's a very interesting operation in Philadelphia. So basically, Alejandro Gacartigas was a very successful student at Harvard University, and he then graduated and took a job with Teach for America. And he was teaching first grade, and he realized that when his students, he was sure that his students were going to be really successful and that they were going to be soaring above all the other classes. And so in October, when he started testing them for their reading levels, he discovered, much to his horror, that they were actually behind the previous June, the levels that they had reached in June the previous, before summer. And he said, what's going on here? Well, it turns out it's what is called summer slide. He was teaching in the very low-income neighborhoods, and what happens, most of us didn't suffer this, because in our summers, our parents were probably educated, we were probably reading, we were probably doing something educational, but in a lot of neighborhoods, that's not the case. They actually don't read, they hang out on the streets, they get into gang fights sometimes, and so they actually retreat in their education process a few months. And so he started something called the Springboard Collaborative. And in that, he was able to recruit all sorts of parents who care about the kids but just don't know how to educate them. And during the summer, 6 weeks, he takes children from these poor neighborhoods and he teaches them how to read. And he teaches their parents how to teach the kids how to read. So you think, oh my gosh, that's a kind of a hard process. How do you teach someone how to read? He's invented these very playful processes, and he's had a lot of success. And I talked to David Williams and his two sons, David and Dakan, and it was amazing how much he was able to do. So when David used to read to his kids, they would protest, they would throw the books around, he would get into fights. It never worked out. And David is this home health aide who was just trying to make ends meet. He was a single dad, and it was very difficult for him, to come home after a long day's work and then to have to read to his kids. But he knew that reading was really important. And so he sent his kids to the Springboard Collaborative. And David, the older son, was able to jump ahead in 6 weeks, jump ahead 6 months in reading. His younger son, who was 8 years old, was able to jump ahead by 12 months in reading. So it's a really successful program. So these are the kinds of ways that there are many change makers and entrepreneurs trying to really address some of the social inequities in our country. And I hope that all of you will not be bystanders, who will actually be engaged. There are really good reasons for getting engaged, and Nick actually will talk to you about those. Thank you.
Good job. Thanks a lot. I'm particularly pleased to be here because I was actually born in Chicago on the South Side, and so it's great to be home. And it's also a treat because, for the most part, Sheryl and I don't travel together because our baby is now a high school senior. And so it is great to be together, although we're a little nervous that right now our house is perhaps the scene of the greatest party in New York history. If you see it on the news, on your Twitter feed, let me know, okay? We wrote A Path Appears in part because after Half the Sky, people kept approaching us and asking, so what do I do? And we wanted to help answer that question. It seemed to us that there are so many people who would like to find a way of making a difference, would like to find an element of meaning, some kind of a higher purpose, but don't really know what to do, feel that the problems are too vast and too overwhelming for an individual to actually matter, or they're worried about corruption or inefficiency in aid groups. And these are all very legitimate concerns. But it does seem to us that, in fact, anybody really can have an impact. And partly that's because of new evidence, and partly because of new platforms. And one person who strikes us as an example of this is an 8-year-old girl. And if an 8-year-old girl can have an impact, then anybody can. This is a girl named Rachel Beckwith, grew up in Seattle, and heard in her church about people needing clean water abroad. So she wondered what she could do about it, and she heard about Charity Water. You guys know about Charity Water? Yeah? So she decided to start a birthday page on the Charity Water website, and she asked for donations for wells in Ethiopia in lieu of birthday presents. She set a goal of raising $300. Then she was a little bummed out that she only ended up raising $200. Well, a few weeks after her 9th birthday, she was in a car accident, and she was taken to the hospital. Friends and people in the community wanted to show support for Rachel and her family, didn't know quite what to do, and so they thought of her birthday page. And they went there, and they donated toward her goal. Quickly, it surged past the original $300 goal, past $1,000, kept rising. And when Rachel was in the hospital fighting for her life, her parents were able to whisper to her, not knowing if she could hear or not, that she had set a new Charity Water birthday record by beating the record that Justin Bieber had previously set. And she would have been hugely tickled by that. But in the end, Rachel did not make it. She died. And that led people in the community even more to want to show some way of commemorating this extraordinarily big-hearted girl doing what they could. And they thought of that birthday page, and they spread it through social media. And in the end, it raised $1.2 million for wells in Ethiopia. And look, that's enough to bring clean water to 30,000 people. And look, nothing can salve the pain for her parents of having lost a daughter at age 9. But I think also for her parents, for the family, this was a way of not only memorializing an extraordinary girl, but it provided an overlay of meaning and purpose to an event that had just seemed horribly tragic and random. And in a larger sense, I think that's something that giving back in one way or another, whether it's donations or advocacy or volunteering, can do for any of us, that our lives so often are chaotic, they're busy, they seem pretty random. And if we find some channel to give back, it is a way of having an overlay of purpose, a moral hierarchy, if you will, to give some larger meaning to it. And one difference from the past is also that we have much better evidence now about how we can make a difference. Partly that's because of research on where you get the most bang for the buck, and it's sometimes surprising. For example, Sheryl and I are huge believers that the best escalator out of poverty is education. Well, how can you most efficiently invest in education globally? How can you most efficiently get one more girl in school somewhere? Actually, any guesses about what the most cost-effective way of getting one more marginal child in school is? Well, it's deworming. We don't think about deworming because our kids don't have intestinal parasites. In much of the world, in much of the developing world, kids do. And when they do, they're anemic, they're more likely to be sick, they miss school, and you can deworm a child for 50 cents a year. Hugely cost-effective. About 100 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation dewormed American kids, and it had this huge effect on their ability to study. We can do the same internationally and have this huge effect. There are a few ways in which we psych ourselves out, and I think One of the ways is that we ask this basic question of, why should I care? And especially when the needs are remote, and remote can mean halfway around the world, or it can mean a different neighborhood in Chicago. That when those needs are remote, then it's easy to tune them out and forget about them, and in some cases even to think, well, maybe in some ways the poor are to blame for poverty, which is one of the most pernicious assumptions we can make of all. So one answer to that is that if you have actually seen a girl who wants to go to school but can't for want of some tiny amount of money, or if you've seen a kid who is blind and can't get sight for want of $100 surgery, then you don't ask that question. But another way of answering it has to do with the benefits, if you will, the benefits to ourselves. And one of the things that Sheryl and I found over and over again is that we start out trying to help people halfway around the world. And the truth is that it's hard. Helping people is harder than it looks. But while our efforts to help others have this, frankly, somewhat mixed record of success, they have this almost perfect record of helping ourselves. And it's true, there is abundant evidence about the degree to which we become more happy and have better health markers when we engage in these efforts. There's some research into mortality rates, and it found that people who join a church or religious organization, mortality drops by 29%. You exercise several times a week, your mortality risk drops 30%. You volunteer a couple of times a week, your mortality risk falls 44%. And the key is if you just manage somehow to volunteer for a religious running organization, you live forever. So we hope that you'll find some way of engaging in these causes. I just want to leave you with one final story about a friend of mine who was a young aid worker in Darfur. And she saw some really terrible things there. But she never broke down. She never showed weakness. And then one day she came, over Christmas vacation, she came back to the US. She's in her grandmother's backyard. And she totally lost it. She just fell apart. She was weeping. You know what it was? Her grandmother had set up a bird feeder. And she saw that bird feeder. She thought about the things she had seen. And she thought how incredibly lucky she was to have been born and to grow up in a country where we pretty much take security for granted, where even in difficult economic times, we, for the most part, have housing, have enough food to eat, and can even help wild birds get through the winter. She thought about that in terms of her good fortune and her responsibility. In the same way, the fact that we are here right now truly means we have won the lottery of birth. When you have won the lottery of birth, I think you do have some obligation to pay it forward in some way. We hope you will find your own channel to do that, and in the course of that, become a little bit happier, more fulfilled as well. Thanks so much.